everyone, in this video we're going to talk about chapter 8, which really focuses on conceptualization in different types of research designs. So we've talked a little bit about conceptualization in some of the previous chapters and given some examples. Remember when we did our chapter about caseload and looking at the relationship between caseload and symptoms of burnout? Well, remember we had to talk about how are we going to define caseload? What does that look like? What does burnout look like? How do we measure that? And so it really can be very challenging. There's a lot of different ways we can conceptualize concepts. Even things like demographic data that people often think is a pretty easy one. Things like gender and ethnicity may vary. You have to be really sensitive to the participant group that you're looking at because they might have a different definition of gender attributes or ethnicity attributes. And so again, that's where looking at literature and looking at theory really helps us even define attributes for things that we might view as like easier to conceptualize. Then we start getting into abstract concepts like love and depression and insecurity, and even those can be super challenging as well. I love using depression because that's a very complicated abstract idea. You might think like, hey, it's not that hard, but you can look at depression through different lenses. You might say that people are feeling depressed as measured by a psychological component, negative thoughts that they have. Or you might say depression is really a physical constellation of symptoms, lethargy and sleeping too much, eating too much, sleeping not enough, eating not enough, those kinds of things. Or you might say, hey, depression is all of it. There's a social component with isolation, there's a psychological component and a physical component. So you really have to figure out like how are we actually going to define or conceptualize this concept. Then once we've conceptualized the variable, said, okay, here's what I think the variable is, here's what the attributes are, then we have to operationalize it. How are we actually going to measure it? Are we going to define something like depression based on the score on a scale? Or are we going to do an observable study where we observe things like their physical hygiene or maybe statements they make that are symptoms of depression? It may be a little bit different. We might do self-report where we just give a survey and say, hey, rate yourself. So there's a lot of different ways we can operationalize things, but you can't really operationalize it. We can't pick the right measurement tool. We can't figure out the study design if we don't know what the concept is in the first place. So again, it's really important to make sure we're conceptualizing things first. We look at the attributes, then we figure out how we're going to measure it. So the book talks about that when you have exploratory or descriptive studies, you won't have a hypothesis. Now with descriptive, that makes sense. You're really just looking at rates of things. You're not saying there's a relationship between one variable and another. You're just saying, hey, I just want to know how many people are dealing with homelessness in my community. So it's not going to have a hypothesis. Now, Rubin and Babbie say that exploratory studies can't have a hypothesis either. But what I found is there are a number that do, where people say, look, this is a really new topic, but we think we might know what happens. Now, obviously, those are not maybe as solid of hypotheses as some other types of studies, but I have seen exploratory studies that do have that. However, as a rule, they don't have to have a hypothesis, an independent variable, or a dependent variable. When you look in an explanatory quantitative study, you do have a hypothesis and an independent and a dependent variable. So you're really looking at and saying, I believe there is a causal relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable, that if I change the independent variable, the dependent variable will change as well. Some hypotheses really just look at the relationships between variables in a very open way. You can have directional or non-directional hypotheses. So a directional hypothesis says, I believe that a change in this is going to increase the dependent variable or decrease the dependent variable. Some people might say, hey, I think there's a relationship between the two, but I'm not exactly sure how changes in the independent variable are going to affect the dependent variable. I just believe that there will be a change, but I want to see what actually happens. So there are a couple different types of relationships. There's a positive, negative, or curvilinear relationship. So let's look at some examples quickly. So maybe you work in a long-term care facility and you start to notice that the older individuals get, it seems like they have more falls, but you're not exactly sure about it. Maybe you look at resident records for the last year in this long-term care facility. And what you find is that as individuals get older, the number of falls increases. Now, you can't necessarily say that age is going to cause falls. There might be another variable at play, such as something like osteoporosis or the development of balance issues. But you just want to at least look at the relationship and say, hey, as people age, are they more vulnerable to falling? And so what you do is you look at the different patient charts, and what you find is, yes, you find that as the age of the client or participant increases, the number of falls increases. So that's really a positive relationship. They're going in the same direction. So if they increase at the same time or decrease at the same time, that is a positive relationship. But if you look at a negative relationship, it's a little bit different. Maybe you say, you know what, I also want to look at cognitive function functioning, because maybe you're like, well, I think there might be a relationship between age and score on this cognitive functioning measurement tool. And so maybe what you find is that as people's age go up, their cognitive score goes down. So one variable goes up, one goes down. And that's what makes up a negative relationship. So again, positive relationship is where both variables either increase or decrease. A negative relationship is where one increases, like age, and one decreases, like cognitive score. So those are the different types, positive and negative relationships, that you can find. This is an example of a curvilinear relationship. And what you find is that a lot of times, depending on your arousal level, you might have different performance issues. So for example, let's say someone who doesn't have a lot of arousal, they go to take a test and they just don't have anything. They don't feel motivated, they don't feel stressed, they just don't feel anything. Maybe their performance is low. Maybe they don't really care about the test. But what we find is as your anxiety or your arousal increases, maybe you're a little bit nervous. It's like if you're going to run a race and your heart rate gets up, you're excited, but you're also nervous, your performance tends to increase. Maybe these are students who are feeling a little anxious and stressed, but it motivated them to study for the test. It motivates them to read every question thoroughly, and so they perform really well. But then what we find is it's curvilinear, because on the other end of things is the higher your arousal, the more anxious you are, your hands shake, your brain races, and maybe you don't do real well on something. So again, if you're low arousal or high arousal, you may not do super well, but those in that medium that feel just motivated enough are the ones that perform the best. So that's an example of a curvilinear relationship. The book also does a really nice job talking about the difference between moderating variables, which are things that affect the strength between independent and dependent variables, mediating variables that become a causal link between an independent and a dependent variable. So again, the example of that is you say, I believe that changes in A cause changes in C. But maybe that's really not necessarily the issue. Maybe it's that things in A cause B and changes in B cause C. And so sometimes that happens where we want to jump to a conclusion and say, A causes B immediately, that's it. But we know that situations in research are complicated. And so sometimes you have a mediating variable that can become that link to show why independent variable changed the dependent variable. They also talk about extraneous variables, which could be just an alternative explanation. Maybe you are looking at the relationship between race and performance in a class, and you want to see, do certain groups of students racially perform better than others? Well, maybe you find that students who perform better than others belong predominantly to one group, like a Caucasian group. Well, maybe the alternative explanation is those in the non-dominant group didn't get as good of education, and so they're not able to perform as well. Or maybe there's a teacher that favors one group of students, one race of students over the other, and so those students that are favored are going to do well. So maybe it has nothing to do with the relationship between race and performance. Maybe there's an alternative explanation, the teacher or things outside or past. And so it's important that when we're doing research, we can't make these very hard conclusions because there are other variables that do affect our relationships. And again, that's where research and literature review and theories come in, because we can try to control for those, but it's something to be aware of. So once we've conceptualized something, we have to measure it. And that's what operationalization is. It's really figuring out, how do we measure something abstract? Typically, there's different ways to do this. So the final thing the book talks about are the levels of measurement. And this can be a little bit tricky sometimes. So the first one we talk about is nominal data. And that's typically categorical data, which means it's something that's like mutually exclusive. You might have someone that says yes or no to a question. You may not have someone say yes or no to the same question. They either are or they aren't. So they're mutually exclusive in that way. You might have a number of something. You wouldn't necessarily have someone say, how many children do you have? 4 and 7. They probably have 4 or they have 7. And things like ethnicity. You might say, do you identify as Hispanic or Latinx origin? Yes or no. You might look at gender and say, are you cisgender or non-binary? So these are categories where you're probably just picking one. We often think of these in terms of demographic data. We also have what's called ordinal data or ranked data. Likert skills are a very kind of a common example of this. Everyone's probably filled out a survey where you have to say you strongly agree, neither agree nor disagree or strongly disagree, and a number is attached to them in some way. An ordinal level of measurement is ranking things in some way. Now, the challenge with this is there's not a clear, consistent difference between each level. You could have someone that says, I don't strongly agree. I agree, but I'm pretty close. Like, I'm not comfortable picking strongly agree, but I agree pretty closely with that. And they pick 2. Or you could have someone say, hey, I don't strongly agree at all. I'm going to select agree because I don't disagree with it, but there's a big gap in their head between strongly agree and agree. So when you're ranking things, there's not a clear defined distance between each ranked item. You're just saying strongly agree is higher than strongly disagree. So that's ordinal, where it's ranked data. Then you have interval levels of measurement. So with an interval variable, you might say, hey, there is a consistent distance between levels. I might say in this case, high is the same distance between high and medium, and low. And so one example we do a lot with this is temperature. So you might say 80 degrees, 90 degrees, and 100 degrees. We can commonly say there's the same distance between 80 and 90 degrees and 90 and 100 degrees, right? We'd say there's 10 degrees. So we know it's interval. It's consistently different between levels. Now, one of the challenges is, can you have 0 degrees? Yes. Can you have negative 15 degrees? Yes. Negative 20. And so with interval data, there's no true 0 because it could fall below. You could say 80, 70, go all the way down, 10, 0, then negative 10, negative 20 in temperature. And so because there isn't a true 0, you can add and subtract, but you can't easily create ratios. So that's where we come in with a ratio level of measurement. What we're saying in this case is there's a consistency in differences between each level, and there's a true 0. So for example, height. You're not necessarily going to have 0 height, right? Because that would probably be nothingness. If you're trying to measure the height of individuals, you're not going to say 0 height. Well, that's nothing. Or you might not say someone makes negative $20,000 a year. So with ratio, you do have a true 0. And because you can have a true 0, unlike temperature, where I can't say, well, 100 degrees is twice as hot as 50 degrees, because you still have negative 10, right? So your scale goes larger. With ratio, you can do a proportion. You can say 50,000 is twice as much as 25,000. You can say that 20,000 is twice as much as people who have 0, and you can start coming up with proportions. So again, the interval, you do have consistency and differences between level, but you don't have a true 0. You can go into negative numbers. Or with ratio, you do have consistency and difference between levels, and there is a true 0. So those are the differences. This is super important because depending on the type of measurement you use, that will change the type of testing that you do, which we'll talk about later in the semester. So you'll see a review of this, but you want to make sure that you're clear that nominal data is like yes, no, some sort of categories. Ordinal is ranked data, like a Likert scale, or what are your favorite top 10 songs, but there's not consistency between the levels. Interval is consistency and differences between levels on both sides of the number line, negative numbers or positive numbers, and ratio has a true 0. We say, hey, it's either 0 or up. And so there's also true differences between those levels and a true difference. Finally, there are my references. I hope this video was helpful, and it should give you a good foundation as we jump into chapter 9, which looks at measurement.